The classical Republican reading Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty, Part 7, Liberty and Sovereignty. The French Revolution, like all great revolutions, was, at least in its Jacobin form, just such an eruption of the desire for positive freedom of collective self-direction on the part of a large body of Frenchmen who felt liberated as a nation, even though the result was, for a good many of them, a severe restriction of individual freedoms. Rousseau had spoken exultantly of the fact that the laws of liberty might prove to be more austere than the yoke of tyranny. Tyranny is service of human masters. The law cannot be a tyrant. Rousseau does not mean by liberty the negative freedom of the individual not to be interfered with within a defined area, but the possession by all, and not merely by some, of the fully qualified members of a society of a share in the public power which is entitled to interfere with every aspect of every citizen's life. The liberals of the first half of the 19th century correctly foresaw that liberty in this positive sense could easily destroy too many of the negative liberties that they held sacred. They pointed out that the sovereignty of the people could easily destroy that of individuals. Mill explained, patiently and unanswerably, that government by the people was not, in his sense, necessarily freedom at all. For those who govern are not necessarily the same people as those who are governed, and democratic self-government is not the government of each by himself, but at best of each by the rest. Mill and his disciples spoke of the tyranny of the majority and of the tyranny of the prevailing feeling and opinion, and saw no great difference between that and any other kind of tyranny which encroaches upon men's activities beyond the sacred frontiers of private life. No one saw the conflict between the two types of liberty better or expressed it more clearly than Benjamin Constant. He pointed out that the transference by a successful rising of the unlimited authority commonly called sovereignty from one set of hands to another does not increase liberty, but merely shifts the burden to slavery. He reasonably asks why a man should deeply care whether he is crushed by a popular government or by a monarch or even by a set of oppressive laws. He saw that the main problem for those who desire negative individual freedom is not who wields this authority, but how much authority should be placed in any set of hands. For unlimited authority in anybody's grasp was bound, he believed, sooner or later to destroy somebody. He maintained that usually men protested against this or that set of governors as oppressive, when the real cause of oppression lay in the mere fact of accumulation of power itself, wherever it might happen to be, since liberty was endangered by the mere existence of absolute authority as such. It is not the arm that is unjust, he wrote, but the weapon that is of absolute authority as such. It is not It is not the arm that is unjust, he wrote, but the weapon that is too heavy. Some weights are too heavy for the human hand. Democracy may disarm a given oligarchy, a given privileged individual or set of individuals, but it can still crush individuals as mercilessly as any previous ruler. In any easy comparing the liberty of the moderns with that of the ancients, he said that an equal right to oppress or interfere is not equivalent to liberty, nor does universal consent to loss of liberty. Somehow, miraculously, preserve it merely by being universal or by being consent. If I consent to be oppressed or acquiesce in my condition with detachment or irony, am I the less oppressed? If I sell myself into slavery, am I the less a slave? If I commit suicide, am I the less dead because I have taken my own life freely. Popular government is a spasmodic tyranny. Monarchy, a more efficiently centralized despotism. Constant saw in Rousseau the most dangerous enemy of individual liberty because he had declared that by giving myself to all, I give myself to none. Constant could not see why, even though the sovereign is everybody, it should not oppress one of the members of its indivisible self, if it so decided. I may, of course, prefer to be deprived of my liberties by an assembly or a family or a class in which I am a minority. It may give me an opportunity one day of persuading the others to do for me that to which I fed, I am entitled. But to be deprived of my liberty at the hands of my family or friends or fellow citizens is to be deprived of it just as effectively. Hobbes was at any rate more candid. He did not pretend that a sovereign does not enslave. He justified the slavery, but at least did not have the effrontery to call it freedom. Throughout the 19th century, liberal thinkers maintained that if liberty involved a limit upon the powers of any man to force me to do what I did not or might not wish to do, then whatever the ideal in the name of which I was coerced, I was not free, that the doctrine of absolute sovereignty was a tyrannical doctrine in itself. If I wish to preserve my liberty, it is not enough to say that it must not be violated unless someone or other, the absolute ruler, or the popular assembly, or the king in parliament, or the judges, or some combination of authorities, or the laws themselves. For the laws may be oppressive, authorizes its violation. I must establish a society in which there must be some frontiers of freedom, which nobody should be permitted to cross. Different names or natures may be given to the rules that determine these frontiers. They may be called natural rights, or the word of God, or natural law, or the demands of utility, or of the permanent interests of man. I may believe them to be valid a priori, or assert them to be my own ultimate ends, or the ends of my society or culture. What these rules or commandments will have in common is that they are accepted so widely and are grounded so deeply in the actual nature of men as they have developed through history as to be by now an essential part of what we mean by being a normal human being. Genuine belief in the inviolability of a minimum extent of individual liberty entails some such absolute stand, for it is clear that it has little to hope for from the rule of majorities. Democracy, as such, is logically uncommitted to it, and historically has at times failed to protect it, while remaining faithful to its own principles. Few governments, it has been observed, have found much difficulty in causing their subjects to generate any will that the government wanted. The triumph of despotism is to force the slaves to declare themselves free. It may need no force. The slaves may proclaim their freedom quite sincerely, but they are nonetheless slaves. Perhaps the chief value for liberals of political positive rights of participating in the government is as a means for protecting what they hold to be an ultimate value, namely individual negative liberty. But if democracies can, without ceasing to be democratic, suppress freedom, at least as liberals have used the word, what would make a society truly free? For Constant, Mill, Tocqueville, and the liberal tradition to which they belong, no society is free unless it is governed by any rate two interrelated principles. First, that no power, but only rights, can be regarded as absolute, so that all men, whatever power governs them, have an absolute right to refuse to behave inhumanely. And second, that there are frontiers, not artificially drawn, within which men could be inviolable, These frontiers being defined in terms of rules so long and widely accepted that their observance has entered into the very conception of what it is to be a normal human being, and therefore also of what it is to act inhumanly or insanely. Rules of which it would be absurd to say, for example, that they should be abrogated by some formal procedure on the part of some court or sovereign body. When I speak of a man as being normal, a part of what I mean is that he could not break these rules easily, without a qualm of revulsion. It is such rules as these that are broken when a man is declared guilty without trial or punished under a retroactive law, when children are ordered to denounce their parents, friends to betray one another, soldiers to use methods of barbarism, when men are tortured or murdered, or minorities are massacred because they irritate the majority or a tyrant. Such acts, even if they are made legal by the sovereign, cause horror even in these days, and this springs from the recognition of the moral validity, irrespective of the laws, of some absolute barriers to the imposition of one man's will on another. The freedom of a society or a class or a group, in this sense of freedom, is measured by the strength of these barriers and the number and importance of the paths which they keep open for their members, if not for all, for at any rate a great number of them. This is almost at the opposite pole from the purposes of those who believe in liberty in the positive self-destructive sense. The former want to curb authority as such, the latter want it placed in their own hands. That is a cardinal issue. These are not two different interpretations of a single concept, but two profoundly divergent and irreconcilable attitudes to the ends of life. It is as well to recognize this, even if in practice it is often necessary to strike a compromise between them, for each of them makes absolute claims. These claims cannot both be fully satisfied, but it is a profound lack of social and moral understanding not to recognize that the satisfaction that each of them seeks is an ultimate value which, both historically and morally, has an equal right to be classed among the deepest interests of mankind.